Welcome to the Calibration Project, where we try to unravel the timeline of history, beginning at the origin of the universe through the early human cultures. My name is Josh Peterson. I'm an engineer. I love science. I love ancient history, and I want to share some of that with you. Here on the Calibration Project, I will be presenting some of my own original research, as well as drawing key observations and interpretations from various scientific papers and insights from others. If you're a student, I will also be dedicating a portion of my efforts to teaching the key skills that allowed me to succeed in engineering school, what I call the cheat codes to science and math. As I mentioned, I'm an engineer, a licensed professional engineer in the state of Florida. I have 10 years experience in heavy construction, specifically water and wastewater infrastructure, treatment plants, pump stations, storage tanks, and all the buildings and pipelines and pumps and machinery that make it so you can take a shower and flush your toilet without even thinking about it. So, how did I know that I wanted to become an engineer? I love figuring things out. I love taking things apart and building them better, and it all started for me as a kid. My dad repaired computers, and the old dead cases would be lined up under the desk, waiting to be disposed of properly. At 8 years old, I began taking them apart. I tested each component by trial and error, and I ended up assembling a complete working machine completely on my own at 8 years old. I was very proud of that achievement, but before my excitement had even died down, my dad sold it to a customer. I was not happy. I didn't even get to keep a penny of the profits. I wonder if my dad even remembers that. I forgive you, Dad. As usual, things that hurt can teach us valuable lessons. I learned resilience. I learned to adapt and to grow. I didn't have a choice when my dad sold my computer. I learned to move on. I started again, and I built the next one 10 times better than the first. I forget the exact specs, but that first computer was ridiculously basic. But having successfully built one computer, I now knew from experience that I couldn't use a faster processor if the motherboard didn't support the faster chip. For the second computer, I knew where to start. I knew what was important in order to build off of. Instead of just starting with the first motherboard that I found, I knew what to look for. I started testing through all the cases, looking for the best motherboards. That second computer turned out 10 times better than the first, and I got to keep it this time. So I'm an engineer. I love figuring out how things work, making things better. I also love science. In particular, I love physics and geology. I'm not exactly sure why I like physics specifically, except that at a foundational level, all other sciences derive how they work, from the laws of physics. Biology, chemistry, astronomy, and geology. All these operate within the laws of motion, within the laws of thermodynamics, within the context of forces and reactions. Topics like magnetism and gravity. How does action at a distance really work? The nature of light. Is it a wave? Is it a particle? Is it a duality? These questions of physics fascinate me. Geology? I do know when that started, but I'm going to pause for that and come back to geology later in my story. My love for science in general started with my high school science teacher. I have never seen anyone as excited and animated and passionate about science as Mrs. Frades, and her love of science was rooted in her love for Jesus Christ. Science was exciting because we were not just learning about the laws of nature. We were learning about the character and the characteristics of the God who created nature. When we observe the laws of motion and the laws of thermodynamics, we see the orderly structure that God set up. When we study biology, we understand the intricate complexity of the cell, the marvelous nanoscale molecular machines that build, that repair, that self-replicate. When we see these, we get a glimpse of God's intelligence and His design. And when we observe the depths of space, the magnitude of the galaxies. We get a hint of the power of the God who set the heavens in motion. We learn to see beauty as an expression of God's creativity. One of my objectives in starting this channel is to share with you some of that same wonder and awe that I experienced learning about science from Mrs. Frates. This brings me to my college experience. I decided to major in engineering because of my love for science and for solving problems and making things better. But as I proceeded through the freshman and sophomore college sciences, I came face to face with the problem. I knew about the standard evolutionary model of Earth history and life evolving over billions of years. That had been part of my high school education, but it had been secondary to the creation perspective. Now, here in college, I was learning the sciences from the opposite perspective. And I want to be clear, I never in any of my classes had an aggressive professor who sought to attack Christian beliefs. Instead, the sciences were taught presupposing evolution to be true. Every topic was introduced and taught in the context of having evolved from such and such over so many millions of years. And isn't it wonderful how random chance resulted in XYZ? Random chance resulting in the marvelous cellular design, the beauty in nature, the orbits of the planets. All these described as ultimately resulting from meaningless and purposeless mixing of atoms over eons of time. On the next slide, I've summarized the two competing stories that I was facing there in the summer of 2011, finishing up my sophomore year of college. To summarize the two conflicting views, as I understood it at the time, we have on the one side the religious view, and the other side the scientific. In the religious view, we trust by faith. In the scientific view, we trust in facts. The origin of everything in the religious view is special creation, where the origin, according to science, is special coincidence. Man is created in God's image versus goo to you via the zoo. Indoctrination on the religious side versus education on the science side. That is, in the religious view, you listen to the Bible stories and don't ask questions, as opposed to learning and practicing the scientific method. On the timeline of history, only thousands of years in the religious view versus billions in the scientific view. At the simplest level, these are the two opposing views for the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the existence of everything that we see today. On the one hand, the scientific view starts with the Big Bang some 14 billion years ago. Our planet Earth emerged 4 to 5 billion years ago, and life began as random charges of electricity sparked across lifeless molecules in the primordial soup. From that first spark of life, according to this narrative, nature advanced ever upwards from the simplest bacteria to modern man through a marvelous chain of coincidence and chance mistakes. The alternative to this scientific view is the religious view. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Plants, animals, and man emerged fully formed in an instant at the sound of God's voice. This creation by God was followed by the rebellion of man, God's judgment of the corrupted earth by a flood in the days of Noah. And the story continues with the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the enslavement of the Israelites in Egypt, and the marvelous delivery by Moses at the Exodus. There are variations on each story, variations on the overall time scale, but the overview is clear. These two narratives present completely different sequence of events, completely different timescales, different acting agents. This was a problem for me. This was the conflict. These two views are not compatible. They are completely opposed to one another. They cannot be reconciled. I'm an engineer. I need to know how things work. How can I make sense of the world with two competing systems that can't both be true? As an engineer, I would be living and making decisions according to the laws of nature. I couldn't bring myself to pretend that the stories of the Bible are true while living according to the laws of science in my day-to-day. And I wasn't going to waste my life living for a lie. I had to know what was true. So, as my sophomore year came to a close, I hit the pause button on my education. I dropped out of college in order to, first, pursue the truth. But, obviously, I'm a licensed engineer today, so my story doesn't end there. If it wasn't clear yet, I believe the Bible is accurate, and I believe that it holds the key to life. So back in the summer of 2011, at the start of what became my 6-month journey in pursuit of the truth, after family vacation that summer, I flew out to Colorado. I went to a 2-week worldview conference, which was the first step on my journey. There, I learned the first 2 keys of the puzzle. First, before we can even ask the question, which of these views is true, I learned that we need to first ask the more fundamental question. What is truth? Now, don't worry. We're not going to take a deep dive into the philosophy here. In fact, we're going to boil the definition down to just 5 words. But before that, a slightly longer definition that I first heard there at the conference. Truth. Truth is when an idea, a belief, or a statement matches the way the world actually is. And I heard this from Greg Kokel from Stand to Reason, who spoke there at the conference. Now, this definition made intuitive sense to me. How do you know something is true? Does it match reality? And that is what I boiled down even further. Truth is when a statement matches reality. 5 words. I underlined the statement because you can insert there idea or belief from the longer definition. Now, this is actually part of the scientific method. You make a hypothesis, you run an experiment to test the hypothesis, and what do you see? You see if it matches reality. Applying this to our question of science or religion, which one of these matches reality? Again, they both can't be true. We can't have both special creation of the universe by God and special coincidence where life emerges randomly by chance. We can't have man made in God's image in the beginning and man the result of a long evolutionary chain of coincidences. Those can't both be true. And this brings me to the second key insight there at the conference. Even though this question is framed in terms of religion versus science, I came to understand that was not actually the question. In reality, both of these are religious worldview systems. And science is an entirely different pursuit that people of both worldviews can and do use. Here, I've labeled the one on the left, biblical creation, since as its foundation, it takes the Bible as the standard of truth. And I've labeled the other one, naturalism, or humanism, because it takes natural law as the ultimate truth. Both of these worldviews are matters of faith. Both of these involve indoctrination in the sense that they're taught as true to the exclusion of the other view. So what then is science? I'm going to refer now to a free open source geology textbook, which I'll be referencing throughout future episodes on this podcast. The textbook is a free resource. It's published by Salt Lake Community College. I will post a link in the description. It has nearly 24 editors and reviewers listed from various colleges, universities, museums, and other geological societies. The opening chapter answers this exact question. What is science? I've highlighted a few key phrases for us to notice as we read through it here. Scientists seek to understand the fundamental principles that explain natural patterns and processes. Science is more than just a body of knowledge. Science provides a means to evaluate and create new knowledge without bias. Scientists use objective evidence over subjective evidence to reach sound and logical conclusions. An objective observation is without personal bias, and the same by all individuals. Humans are biased by nature, so they cannot be completely objective. The goal is to be as unbiased as possible. A subjective observation is based on a person's feelings and beliefs and is unique to that individual. Establishing truth in science is difficult because all scientific claims are falsifiable, which means any initial hypothesis may be tested and proven false. I'm going to skip down. Falsifiability separates science from pseudoscience. Scientists are wary of an explanation of natural phenomena that discourage or avoid falsifiability. An explanation that cannot be tested or does not meet scientific standards is not considered science, but pseudoscience. From this, we learn the following about science. Science involves making observations about the world. The observations need to be objective, that is, free from personal bias. It was noted that it's difficult to keep personal bias out of the observations, and that's true of both the biblical creation worldview and the naturalistic worldview. Science involves making hypotheses, and specifically, they must be falsifiable. A frequent charge against the creation scientists is that their hypotheses cannot be falsified, but the same is true about evolution, since evolution involves timescales in the millions of years, well beyond the ability of humans to observe. Science involves experimentation, which is repeatable. But when evaluating history, especially ancient history and the origin of the universe, these are events which have passed. We can do the science of archaeology today. We can examine the artifacts. But we can't directly observe the history that occurred thousands of years ago. These all highlight the fact that science is in the present, whereas both the creationist and the naturalist worldviews involve claims about the origin of life and distant history. We, as scientists and engineers, we're conducting experiments now in the present. None of us were there in the beginning. The best we can all do is test our models against the science that we're conducting today. Does the model of the created universe better match our observations of the world? I'm going to borrow now the phraseology of my favorite YouTuber, Fractal Woman. I'll talk a little more about her channel in my acknowledgments at the end of the episode. But adapting her statement to my objectives here at the Calibration Project, here's the thing. We cannot absolutely answer the question, is the universe created? We can only answer the question, can the universe be created? If we let the universe be created right off the top, then what does that bias? As you can see, I'm asking a fundamentally different question. Can the universe be created? Can there be a model of the universe where design, where life, where consciousness and beauty are a prediction? Is this model simpler than the legacy models of evolution? Can this model be used to explain the universe better than the legacy paradigm? Can the complex geology, the complex paleontology, archaeology, and physics that we observe today be better explained from the perspective of the creation of the universe by God? My particular interest is the science and history of the beginnings, from creation through approximately the Exodus in the Bible. The inspiration for my Calibration Project name is that, first of all, I'm an engineer, so I like to use science language. And to calibrate in science means to bring an instrument's measurements into conformance with a standard in order to accurately record and accurately convey information. Most critically in our lives, our minds need to be calibrated so that we think accurately and we understand reality. The standard of truth to which I seek to calibrate my thinking is the Bible. The Bible, God's revealed truth to man. And therefore, it's the standard by which I seek to calibrate my mind and my thoughts. Over the coming episodes, we're going to take a scientific look at a variety of questions related to the timeline of history. And I want you to understand that Christians can be scientific and can apply the scientific methods. We'll review the current status of the creation science model, which, to be quite frank, is a basic framework at best. But I'm going to be presenting some of my own original research. We will have a particular focus on identifying and highlighting constraints that any model for interpreting Earth history needs to address in order to refine a model of our own. We're going to do some live exploration on Google Maps, the National Map LiDAR data. We're going to look at research papers that are published in major scientific journals. We'll read them in light of the scientific method, and we're going to separate the science from the worldview. Then, we're going to apply the biblical creation view to interpret the observations. I'm going to introduce key terminology and dating methods and highlight issues that the authors who are using the standard evolutionary model point out in their own papers. I'm going to briefly introduce now a section which I've titled Questioning the Narrative, and by narrative, I'm referring to both the scientific evolutionary story and the biblical creationist story. I'm going to list out some questions that have captured my interest. Some of these questions are being asked by various personalities on YouTube, or the History Channel, or the Discovery Channel, or elsewhere, but their answers don't make sense to me, especially when they're tested against the standard of God's revealed word in the Bible. First, the pyramids. How were the pyramids constructed? How did the ancient Egyptians cut stone, including hard granite with copper tools? How did they lift and move heavy blocks without having even invented the wheel? Some of the heaviest granite stones were transported hundreds of miles. Did Abraham see the pyramids in Egypt? Did the enslaved Israelites build the pyramids? On the conventional timeline, the pyramids predated Abraham. That is, if he really existed and isn't just legendary. On the 6,000-year timeline, Abraham would have been born around 350 years after the flood, and the exodus from Egypt would have been somewhere around 500 years later in rough numbers, at which point the pyramids most certainly must have existed. Or are the pyramids a leftover relic of the pre-flood world, as has been suggested by some? Were they built by contemporaries of Noah and survived the flood? I mentioned the term antediluvian here on the slide because I see that frequently mentioned on several YouTube channels that I follow. They keep using that word, and I don't think it means what they think it means. But we'll save that discussion for a future episode. Right now I pose the questions that we'll seek to answer later. The Younger Dryas cometary impact hypothesis has received a lot of chatter and attention over the past few years. It's been a favorite topic among certain alternative history personalities. Did a comet hit North America 13,000 years ago? Did it cause the extinction of the mammoths? How can we reconcile the timelines of history, that 13,000 years, with the timeline of the Bible? That needs to be addressed. Again, we don't have time now to dig into this, but we'll return to it in more detail in future episodes. Atlantis, another favorite among certain alternative history personalities. Was Atlantis a real city? Was it just legendary? How could Atlantis be destroyed 12,900 years ago, as proposed by some, if the Earth is only 6,000 years old? Or, from a mainstream scientific archaeological perspective, how could Atlantis be destroyed at all in the manner that's described, given the uniformitarian paradigm and the magnitude of the event that would have destroyed Atlantis? And that last line, Was Atlantis the capital city of a pre-flood empire? I'm again referring to that antediluvian thinking that Atlantis may have been the capital city of a pre-flood empire. And geology. How can the intricate geologic features survive for millions of years? There was just a news story a couple days ago about two men who were arrested for pushing over a 140 million year old rock formation off a cliff. How can these formations last for 140 million years, only to get pushed off a cliff by two men? A couple weeks ago, there was a similar case of a rock in Africa, pushed over by a man. How can the age of these rocks be reconciled with the timeline of the Bible? These 140 million year old rock formations, for example, but in general the radioisotope dating methods, which give ages up to billions of years old. I think the oldest rock sample that's been identified has been over 2 billion years old. What about the vast scale of sedimentary rock deposits? The thickest series of sedimentary layers is around 20,000 feet thick. Think about that. 20,000 feet thick. Sedimentary rock, by definition, is deposited underwater. Where did that sediment come from? What about the fossils within that sediment? I love geology, and I could go on and on and on. Geology will be a main theme on this podcast, especially because in the standard evolutionary model, their ultimate standard for the timeline of history is based off the geologic timescale. I'm going to conclude this introductory episode here with a very brief overview of the geologic timescale, since it is so important. And next time, we'll resume the story in greater detail. The naturalistic, humanistic story of the Earth begins around 4.6 billion years ago. I've highlighted the timescale column, and I've pointed out the 4,600 MYA, or million years ago, date, which is equivalent to the 4.6 billion years. We will look in greater detail at this on the next podcast, but I want to highlight specifically here that the timescale covers the gradualistic evolution from inorganic rocks and minerals down at the bottom, through the earliest life forms, to vertebrates, dinosaurs, and ultimately man, over the course of long ages. Millions of years, as described there in that timescale. At the very top, just a sliver, we have the entire 5,000 or so years of recorded history. That is, the entire written historical records of the Egyptians, Babylonians, Persians, Mongols, Chinese, Indians, all the cultural elements that we know, the pyramids, Angkor Wat, Machu Picchu, Homer, Plato, Archimedes, all the biblical characters, Abraham, Joseph, Moses, King David, Daniel, Jesus. In the naturalistic evolutionary timeline, all these civilizations, people, and biblical stories are just a final blip. Just a tiny sliver in a story that spans billions of years. The events of the Bible, creation, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah, the Tower of Babel, Abraham, those events of prehistory, where do they fit in? How do those events fit in the 4.6 billion years before recorded history? In contrast, the biblical story has a completely different timeline. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This was followed by the fall of man, sin, corruption, and ultimately, God's judgment of the world by a great flood in the days of Noah and his sons. After the flood, the nations were dispersed throughout the world at the Tower of Babel, followed by the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who became the father of the 12 sons of the 12 tribes of Israel, the enslavement of the Israelites under Pharaoh of Egypt, and the Exodus, when Israel conquered the Promised Land. Finally, I want to thank you for listening to me today. Thank you for spending a few minutes of your valuable time with me. I'm not trying to convince you of anything today, but I do hope that I caught your attention and gave you something to think about so that we can continue the conversation in future episodes. I also want to thank Mrs. Frades, my high school science teacher, who was passionate about the sciences, passionate about Jesus, and she opened my eyes to the wonders of the natural world, geology, physics, the human body. And as she did that, she also opened my eyes to see and to recognize the wondrous God who created everything. I can say with complete conviction that I love science today because of the influence of Mrs. Frades, and I love God today also because of the influence of Mrs. Frades. Thank you to Fractal Woman, my favorite YouTuber. I'll put a link to her channel in the description. She's been kind enough while responding to a couple of my comments to encourage me to follow through and create videos. I've linked a couple of my favorite videos in the description. If you like physics, if you're curious about light, magnetism, quantum physics, the ether, go check out her channel. While you're waiting for me to post my next videos, go check out her videos. I'm going to devote several episodes in the future to following up on interesting topics that she addresses. Finally, I want to thank my wife for all of her love and support. Talk to you guys again soon.